I recorded my own daughter admitting she tried to kill me, and I have to decide if I'm going to let her get away with it. But that morning, I was just making coffee. It was a Tuesday morning, June 14th. I'll never forget it. I was stirring cream into my third cup of coffee, the cheap kind they kept in the break room at the Prime Rib. The Prime Rib. God, that name still tastes like ash in my mouth. I'd worked 60-hour weeks for 20 years to build that restaurant empire for Richard, my boss. I knew every vendor, every broken floor tile, every disgruntled line cook. I was the engine he just pointed and revved. I should have known when he hired his nephew, a kid fresh out of business school who called me chief, that something was coming, but I trusted him. God, I trusted him. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the text came through. Not an email, not a call, a text. Richard needs to see you in his office. Now, do not bring anything. That last sentence. It was like cold metal touching my skin. I felt my chest tighten. I knew. I waited. Listened. Nothing. The kitchen hummed with its usual pre-lunch panic. But to me, the noise was gone, replaced by a suffocating tension. The coffee had gone cold in my hands. I set the mug down, the ceramic clinking against the counter, a sound that was deafening in my ears. I walked the long, pale hallway to Richard's office, the air conditioning feeling arctic against my skin. He didn't stand up. He didn't even look up from the folder on his mahogany desk. "Have a seat, David," he said. His voice was flat, sterile like hospital air. He sat. The leather chair squeaked. I looked at his expression, the slight downturn of his mouth, the way his fingers were steepled together, and I saw the betrayal. This wasn't a conversation. This was an execution. "I need to tell you something," he began. I couldn't say it. Not yet. I just waited, listened. My heartbeat was racing, a desperate drum inside my ribs. "It's about the future of the company. It's changing. We're going younger, more agile," he finally said, sliding a thin, pale envelope toward me. I looked at the envelope, then back at his eyes. No remorse. Just cold calculation. Younger. Agile. I repeated. "Richard, I just finalized the lease negotiation for the new Chicago spot. I trained every manager in this city. What are you actually saying?" He sighed, an impatient sound. "David, you're 55. You're too old. Frankly, you're becoming a liability. The metrics are declining. The energy isn't there." The words hit me like a physical punch. "You're too old. 2 decades of 60-hour weeks. Missing my daughter's dance recitals. Missing anniversaries. All for this man. For this empire. And now I was being discarded because of a number." "You're firing me?" I asked. My voice was a whisper, rough and used. He finally looked up. "Effective immediately, but we're generous. 6 months severance. Non disparagement clause. Sign this and the money's yours." I laughed. It wasn't a nice sound. It was the sound of something inside me snapping. "Generous? You're using my own life against me. You've built your yacht on my back, Richard." I stood up. I didn't sign the paper. I just walked out. I should have known when he started taking those private calls in the back office, the ones he always ended by saying, "It's handled," that something was wrong. I should have noticed how the new security camera in the hallway was aimed directly at my office door. But I was stupid. I was loyal. For exactly 47 minutes, I sat in my car in the parking lot. Broke. Technically not entirely broke, but my checking account was a joke. I hadn't looked at my personal finances in years. Richard handled everything for me, a perk he'd insisted on. The only thing I knew I still had was my old childhood savings account at the Third National Bank downtown. The one my parents opened when I was 7. It had $500 in it back in 1985. A sentimental relic, nothing more. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you know this feeling. The bottom drops out of your world. And if you're here right now, I see you. Drop a broken heart below. I drove there. The bank lobby was quiet, the marble floors cold and gleaming. I felt like a ghost walking in. I took a number, waited my turn. The teller, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, smiled at me. "How can I help you, sir?" "I need to close this account," I said, sliding the old, yellowed passbook across the counter. "It's a childhood savings account. David Thorne." She typed the number in. Her smile vanished. Her eyes went wide. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Sir," she whispered, her hands trembling. "This account, it has an automatic stock purchase plan attached to it from 40 years ago. A long-term investment mandate." "Isterte here." "What are you talking about?" "It was a $500 account." She didn't answer. She printed the statement. The machine whirred loudly, filling the sudden, heavy silence. She slowly turned the paper around for me to see. What I saw made my knees buckle. The number wasn't $500. It wasn't even $50,000. It was a staggering number, one with more zeros than I could immediately process. It was enough. Enough to laugh in Richard's face. Enough to never work again. But the relief only lasted a second. I looked at the name of the stock company. The name of the company my parents had implicitly instructed the bank to invest in for 4 decades. And that company name made my blood run cold. It was the one piece of evidence that changed everything. It meant my parents knew something. Knew a huge, impossible secret. And then I heard a familiar voice from behind me. "David? Is that really you?" I turned. Standing 3 feet away, holding a deposit slip, was Richard. I followed her and recorded everything. Richard's face, usually the mask of cool, calculated indifference, was etched with surprise, then suspicion. He was standing right there, 3 feet away, holding a deposit slip for the same Third National Bank I had just walked into. The sheer, impossible coincidence made my blood run cold. "David," he said, his eyes scanning me. My worn jacket, the stack of papers in my hand. "What are you doing here? I assumed you'd be traveling." He meant mourning. Mourning the death of my career, the betrayal, and the sudden, humiliating lack of an income. "Taking care of personal business," I replied, the words clipped and flat. My hand, hidden below the counter, clenched around the statement Sarah, the teller, had just handed me. I had memorized the number, $2.7 million. And the stock name, Pacific Coast Land Development. "Well," Richard chuckled, a dry, rehearsed sound. "Good luck with that. You'll be hearing from my lawyer about the non-disparagement clause." "I look forward to it," I said, meeting his gaze. Liar. Part of me died right there. I should have kept my mouth shut, but I nodded anyway. He walked away, a heavy, deliberate sound. I watched him go, a terrifying suspicion blossoming in my chest. Why this bank? Richard lived clear across town. His bank was always the corporate giant, Global Trust, not this small, local branch. The shock of the $2.7 million had momentarily eclipsed the shock of the stock name. Now, standing alone, The silence of the bank lobby felt suffocating. Pacific Coast Land Development. I knew that name, not from the stock market, from the old, yellowing documents I'd seen my father hide in a metal box decades ago. PCLD. It was the name of the company that had bought the plot of undeveloped coastal land my father had always called his retirement dream. He had sold it right before his sudden death, right before my mother moved us across the country. My father had always claimed he lost money on the deal. The stock suggested the opposite. It suggested a payoff, a secret settlement. I didn't know it then, but finding Richard at that bank would save my life. It was 2:15 p.m. when I finally walked out, the cashier's check for the account balance safely tucked away, but the stock, the PCLD stock, was held in a separate brokerage. I had to investigate. I drove to my mother's house. She was 78 now, frail, and living in a small retirement community. She was knitting when I walked in. The quiet atmosphere felt eerie. "David, what a surprise, dear. Why aren't you at work?" she asked, her voice light. I sat down, forcing myself to be calm. "I was fired, Mom. Richard said I was too old." Her knitting needles stilled. The sudden absence of the clicking sound filled the room. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry. You built that for him." "I know," I said, "but that's not why I'm here. I closed my old savings account today. The one from 1985. I paused, watching her face. The color drained instantly. Her trembling hands tightened around the yarn. "That old thing? Why would you do that?" she stammered. "Because the statement had something interesting on it. An automatic stock purchase plan. PCLD. Pacific Coast Land Development." Kept my voice low, confessional. Dad sold the coastal land to them right before he died. He always said he lost everything in the deal, remember? Why would he have an account buying their stock for 40 years if he was ruined by them? She looked away, her eyes fixed on the empty space above my shoulder. "I don't know, David. It was a long time ago. Your father, he handled the finances." Liar. That was the moment everything changed. I thought. My mother was a terrible liar. Her breathing became shallow. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I realized then that the truth was hidden somewhere in 1985, and Richard, my former boss, was somehow connected to it. But how? I knew some of you have lived through something like this. You're not alone. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. 2 days later, I was sitting in my beat-up sedan, parked 3 blocks from Richard's house. I was following my mother. I didn't know why, but the fear in her eyes was a siren. She left her retirement community at 9 p.m., an insane time for her, and drove straight to the most exclusive part of the city. She pulled up to a massive, dark mansion I didn't recognize. I waited, listened. Nothing. Then the front door of the mansion opened. A man stepped out, and the light from the foyer fell across his face. It was Richard. My trembling hands fumbled for my phone. I zoomed in, clicking the record button. My mother and Richard weren't just exchanging pleasantries. Richard took her arm, pulling her close, and whispered something in her ear. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I could only capture the movement, the body language, the shared, intimate guilt. I should have known when he fired me that Richard wasn't just being cruel. He was being surgical. But why would my mother be secretly meeting him at midnight? Why the PCLD stock? As they finally stepped inside the dark house, a single horrifying sentence from my father's funeral years ago flashed through my mind. If I just looked at his phone 1 week earlier. But I trusted him. God, I trusted him. My father had been holding something back, and my mother was protecting that secret. I didn't know it then, but the video I recorded of my mother entering Richard's house would become the key piece of evidence in a courtroom months later. But what I noticed next, the brief flicker of light I caught in Richard's hand as he closed the massive oak door, changed the entire trajectory of my revenge. He wasn't holding a key. He was holding my father's vintage gold lighter, the one I thought had been lost in the fire 3 days after his funeral. My husband's secret phone had her name. The sight of my father's vintage gold lighter in Richard's hand, shining briefly under the porch light as he ushered my mother into his house, was a cold shock that stopped my breathing. That lighter was supposed to be gone. I remembered holding it years ago, smelling the faint scent of lighter fluid and tobacco, right before the funeral. My mother had wept, saying it was the only thing of his she couldn't save from the small fire in the garage, the one that supposedly destroyed all his documents. I didn't know it then, but that lighter was the thread that would unravel 40 years of carefully constructed lies. I drove home, running on pure adrenaline and the sickening certainty that Richard wasn't just my former boss. He was an active, intimate participant in my family's history. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my empty, small apartment, the new cashier's check for the $2.7 million feeling less like a lifeline and more like blood money. Wednesday morning, June 15th. I'll never forget it. I had to find out why Richard had been at the bank and why he was meeting my mother. I needed digital evidence. I went to the prime rib offices under the pretense of collecting my final check and personal items. The new security system Richard had installed was predictable. A single login screen, easy to guess the password of, his daughter's birthday. I got into his empty office, the scent of expensive leather and betrayal heavy in the air. I didn't find the lighter, but what I found was arguably worse. Hidden behind a heavy, antique globe on his bookshelf, there was a small, prepaid burner phone. I picked it up. My hands were trembling, but my chest felt tight with a furious calm. The phone was fully charged. I scrolled through the text messages. They were all coded. References to the package, the transfer, and a recurring name, the architect. I couldn't crack the meaning of the messages, but the call log was screamingly clear. There was only one contact saved. Under the name, the architect, I clicked on the contact details. The associated name was Miriam Thorne. Miriam Thorne, my mother. I stared at the screen, the bright glow of the burner phone illuminating the dark realization in the office. My mother wasn't just covering for Richard. They were partners. They had been secretly communicating for what looked like weeks, maybe months. Was I too late? I scrolled back through the call history. Just yesterday, Tuesday morning, June 14th, the day I was fired, there were 3 missed calls. All from Miriam, the architect, and 2 calls after 9 p.m., after she had been seen entering his house. I took the phone. It was evidence, proof. I slipped it into my pocket, the cold plastic a hard knot of reality. Looking back now, I see the pattern. Richard fires me, knowing I'm now desperate and broke. He probably assumed I'd never check that old, forgotten account. He was waiting. But for what? The stock name, PCLD, and the phone calls to my mother were the only 2 variables he couldn't control. My phone screen glowed in the dark office. A text message from my mother. David, I need to see you. I have something to tell you about your father. I drove straight to her house. The small bungalow felt different now, imbued with a sinister, heavy silence. She was waiting for me in the living room. Richard called me this morning, she started. her voice a thin thread. He said you were snooping. I have his phone, Mom. I cut in. I dropped the burner phone onto the coffee table. It landed with an impact that was deafening in the small room. The one with the architect, saved as the only contact. The one that's listed under Miriam Thorne. She didn't flinch. That absence of immediate panic was worse than any crying fit. It meant she had prepared this, rehearsed it. I need to tell you the truth, David, she said, finally meeting my eyes. They were hard, distant. It wasn't Richard who fired you. It was me. I felt the blood drain from my head. What? I am the architect. Richard is my subordinate now. He's been managing the portfolio for years. She took a long, slow breath. The PCLD stock, the $2.7 million, that was never your father's retirement dream. It was the payout from an embezzlement scheme in 1985. Your father was an accessory. He got scared, David. He wanted to confess. That's why he had the fire. To destroy the evidence. That's why he died. Part of me died that day. I couldn't process it. My gentle, loving father was a criminal? My boss, Richard, was working for my frail, elderly mother? The fire didn't destroy everything, she continued, her voice gaining strength, becoming almost professional. Your father's life insurance policy? It named Richard as the secondary beneficiary. A precaution. Richard and I have been partners in protecting the PCLD fortune ever since. The plan was always to let Richard keep you employed, to keep you broke, compliant, and in the dark. We couldn't risk you finding the account. But why fire me now? I asked, my voice barely a choke. Because the SEC audit is coming. And Richard got nervous. We needed to push you out, eliminate you as a risk factor, and transfer the PCLD assets before the whole thing collapsed. She paused, turned. I did it for your own protection. I stood up, shaking my head. You destroyed my life. You had me betrayed by the man I worked for. And you used my father's death to build a lie. She reached out her hand, a gesture of desperate pity. I took a step back. I need to tell you something else, she whispered. I couldn't say it. Not yet. I just waited. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of old perfume and suffocating tension. The gold lighter, she confessed, her eyes finally breaking. Richard gave it back to me. It has something hidden inside. It was your father's last secret. The lawyer told me something impossible. I stared at my mother, Miriam. The gold lighter has something hidden inside? And you gave it to Richard? No, she corrected, her voice now barely above a whisper, laced with regret. Richard found it and kept it after the fire. He used it as leverage, David. Leverage to force me to keep him in charge of the PCLD portfolio. He knew I'd rather lose the money than expose your father. When he gave it back to me that night, when you saw us, it was his way of saying the partnership was over. The SEC audit is coming, and he needed to break clean before the investigation hit. The emotional peak was reached. My father, the beloved figurehead, was a criminal accessory. My mother, the kind, knitting grandmother, was the architect of a decades-long financial cover-up. And Richard, the man who had just fired me for being too old, was simply a scared accomplice trying to cut his losses. I didn't know it then, but Richard's fear would become my greatest weapon. I walked out of my mother's house and drove straight to the office of a family lawyer recommended years ago by my father, a man named Thomas Vance. I needed to know the impossible. Could I, as the heir to the legitimate portion of the estate, Use this illegal stock fortune to destroy Richard without implicating my own parents? I walked into Vance's office the next morning. The air smelled of old paper and dust. It was quiet, professional. I recounted the entire story. The firing, the $2.7 million discovery, the PCLD stock, the burner phone, the confession, and the terrifying detail of the gold lighter. Vance listened without interruption. For exactly 47 minutes, I spoke. When I finished, the heavy silence returned. You've presented 3 distinct crimes here, David, Vance said, his voice measured. Embezzlement from 1985, obstruction of justice, and potentially fraud and conspiracy in the present day. I don't want to see my mother in jail, I pleaded. I want to destroy Richard. He used his position, my family's crime, and my loyalty to crush me. He has to pay. Vance leaned back, his expression morally ambiguous. Some choices don't have right answers. They just have consequences. What are the consequences for Richard? I pressed. Vance turned on his computer. The PCLD fortune is dirty, but the stock was bought in your name by an automatic bank plan you had no knowledge of. You are legally an innocent beneficiary. We can use that innocence. He started pulling up corporate records, and what he showed me made my head spin. Look at Richard's filing from 1985, Vance instructed. He was listed as a junior financial consultant for PCLD. He was a small player in the original scheme. And look at his current tax records. The documents glowed on the screen. Richard, the man who owned an entire chain of upscale restaurants, claimed only a modest annual salary. The rest of his wealth, the yacht, the mansion, was all tied up in corporate shell companies. Richard has structured his entire life to avoid taxes and liability, Vance explained. He's built his yacht on your back, but he hasn't declared the income used to buy it. So he's untouchable, I concluded bitterly. No, Vance countered, a slight smile touching his lips. He's overexposed. I need one thing, David. One piece of real evidence that ties Richard to the ongoing conspiracy after your father's death. Something concrete. The burner phone with my mother's number on it, I offered. Good, but better. We need the lighter. Vance's eyes were sharp. Your mother said it held your father's last secret. That sounds like a dying declaration. Confession. If your father created a document stating Richard was involved, that would be proof of ongoing fraud. I drove immediately back to my mother's house. I found her in the garden, looking tired, older than her 78 years. The lighter, Mom. Richard gave it back. Where is it? I asked, dispensing with greetings. She pointed to a small wooden box on her bedside table. I kept it here. I couldn't bear to open it. I opened the box. The gold lighter, engraved with my father's initials, lay nestled on velvet. My trembling hands carefully examined the object. It didn't look like it opened, but I noticed a nearly invisible seam running along the bottom. I pushed the hinge and the base popped open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded cotton, was a tightly rolled-up piece of thermal paper. It was clearly from a cash register or an old fax machine. I carefully unrolled the fragile paper. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a dying letter. It was a receipt. A receipt from a storage unit company in Miami, dated exactly 48 hours after my father's funeral. The client name on the receipt was Richard's. The item stored was listed simply as safe deposit box contents. I didn't know it then, But this seemingly innocuous receipt would lead me to the one discovery that would permanently ruin Richard and prove my mother was lying about everything. And then I heard her voice from inside the house. "Hello, David. I was hoping I'd find you here." I froze. It wasn't my mother's voice. It was deep, female, and utterly chilling. I froze, the thermal paper receipt for the Miami storage unit still clutched in my hand. The voice wasn't my mother's. It was deep, female, and utterly chilling, carrying the sharp, sterile echo of a long-term grudge. It wasn't the voice of Miriam Thorne, the architect. "Hello, David. I was hoping I'd find you here," the voice repeated. I carefully slid the storage unit receipt back into the hollow of the gold lighter, closed the seam, and slipped the heavy object into my jeans pocket. I turned slowly toward the hallway. Standing there, framed by the late afternoon sun spilling through the front door, was a woman I recognized instantly. Her hair was the same sharp, silver white as my mother's, but pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Her tailored suit looked like it cost more than my first car. It was Eleanor Vance, Thomas Vance's partner, the sharpest lawyer in the state. "Eleanor," I managed, my voice rough. "What are you doing here?" "I just spoke to Thomas this morning." She didn't smile. "Thomas is my ex-husband, David, and he sends his best. However, this isn't a social call. I'm here on behalf of your mother, Miriam." I looked toward the garden, where my mother was still tending to her petunias, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding inside. On her behalf for what? To congratulate her on being the architect of a multimillion-dollar fraud. Eleanor stepped fully into the room, her presence radiating power and cold calculation. "Miriam is in deep, David. Deeper than she let you believe. And frankly, so are you. The PCLD fortune is in my name, purchased automatically. I'm an innocent beneficiary," I argued, remembering Thomas Vance's words. "That's the legal theory. The reality is messy," Eleanor countered. "Richard knows about the lighter. He knows about the storage unit in Miami. He knows that your father wasn't just an accessory, David. He knows that your father was the one who fabricated the evidence against Richard in 1985 to cover his own tracks." The room spun. "My father framed Richard? Why?" "To survive the first internal audit. Your father needed a fall guy, and Richard was a naive junior consultant. The fire that destroyed your father's files? It was arson. Your father burned evidence that would have implicated Miriam, not him. But he needed insurance, the lighter with the secret receipt, to protect them both if Richard ever tried to blackmail them. The truth was a sudden, violent blow. My father, the man I revered, wasn't just a crook. He was a traitor and a manipulator. I should have known when he always dismissed any questions about the coastal land sale as just bad luck, that there was more to the story. Richard gave the lighter back because he's terrified of the SEC, Eleanor continued, her voice low, but he also did it to get Miriam to confess the real secret, that she was the one who orchestrated the whole scheme, including the fake fire story. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't there to threaten me. She was there to offer an impossible deal. "Miriam wants to confess everything," she said. "She wants to save you. If you agree to sign over the PCLD fortune to a trust, she will take full responsibility for the embezzlement and the obstruction of justice. Richard goes down for the current conspiracy, and you, David, walk away clean. Broke, but clean. Your family name will be damaged, but legally, you're safe." I looked at my hand, at the outline of the lighter in my pocket, holding the Miami receipt. "You're asking me to give up $2.7 million, the only thing that proves I was right, to save my mother from the consequences of her own choices." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Family doesn't always mean safety. But some doors, once you close them, should never be opened again." I needed proof the Miami storage unit was real. I needed to know what was in that safe deposit box. I couldn't trust Richard, and I certainly couldn't trust my mother or the lawyer trying to save her. "I'll think about it," I said, a stone in my gut. "But I need one night. I need to process this." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. She knew I was already emotionally damaged. I watched her leave, her movements sharp and deliberate. That night, I drove to Richard's mansion. It was 11:47 p.m. when I parked 2 blocks away. I had the burner phone, the one with the architect, saved, the gold lighter, and the Miami storage unit receipt. I knew the plan Richard and Miriam had cooked up was fragile. Richard was panicking about the SEC. I walked up to the mansion, the heavy silence of the neighborhood pressing in. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I used the security code Richard had told me years ago for the staff entrance, his daughter's birthday. It worked. The house was dark, smelling faintly of old wood and expensive cigars. I moved through the massive foyer, my heart racing, feeling the cold metal of the lighter against my thigh. I heard his footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate. I found Richard in his home office, sitting behind his desk, just like the day he fired me. But this time he looked genuinely terrified. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, his hand visibly trembling. "David," he whispered, his eyes wide. "How did you get in here?" I dropped the burner phone onto his mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "I used the code you taught me. Happy birthday, Sarah. I'm here because I found the gold lighter and the receipt inside." His trembling hand nearly dropped the glass. "Miriam told you?" "She told me you were involved. She told me she was the architect. But she didn't tell me my father framed you in '85 to save her. She didn't tell me the Miami storage unit is where you kept the real proof." I watched him. The realization hit him. I was not the naive, broke employee anymore. I was a credible threat. I confronted them both at midnight, I thought, the phrase echoing the gravity of the moment. I needed Richard to choose. "I need to know what's in that storage unit, Richard," I demanded. "And you're going to tell me. Is it the real ledger? Is it my father's full confession?" He took a long swallow of his drink. He looked morally complex. He wasn't pure evil. He was just a terrified man who had spent 40 years protecting a bad decision. "The lawyer told you something impossible," Richard muttered, his voice barely audible. "The safe deposit box. It holds the truth about the fire. The fire didn't destroy all the evidence. David created a legal loophole." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a key, worn and tarnished. It was the key to the Miami storage unit. "I need to tell you something," he whispered. "Your father, he didn't die of a heart attack. He took his own life. And he used the fire to make sure the evidence he created, the safe deposit box, would become public, exposing everyone, including himself. The box isn't a confession. It's an instruction." I stumbled back. My father committed suicide? And my mother lied about it for 4 decades to preserve a criminal fortune? "The key is yours," Richard said, sliding it across the desk. "Go to Miami, open the box, and then, David, you and I can finally talk about justice. Because what's in there, what I found in his briefcase years ago, It will destroy you. I stood in Richard's dark, opulent office, the cold brass key to the Miami storage unit burning a hole in my palm. Richard's confession, that my father didn't die of a heart attack, but took his own life, hit me with the force of a physical blow. He took his own life, I repeated, the whisper tasting like ash. And my mother let me believe for 40 years that he died peacefully? That she was the victim? Richard, finally stripped of his CEO armor, looked like a broken man. She needed the PCLD fortune, David. She needed the comfort of the lie. Your father's death was messy, a public scandal waiting to happen. She covered it up to save herself, and maybe to save you from the real truth. I turned, shaking my head. I couldn't breathe the air in that room anymore. The mansion was a tomb built on lies. I didn't sign the non-disparagement clause. I didn't want the severance. I just wanted the truth that Richard's fear had finally prized open. I drove out of the city and headed south. For 18 hours I drove. The rhythm of the highway was a desperate drum, a relentless beat pushing me toward Miami. I didn't stop, couldn't. If I just looked at his phone 1 week earlier, if I'd been more curious about that fire, more skeptical of my mother's tears, perhaps none of this would be happening now. But I trusted them. God, I trusted them. It was Friday morning, June 17th, when I finally reached the address on the thermal paper receipt. The building was a concrete bunker, an anonymous, sterile storage facility on the outskirts of Miami. It felt like the perfect place to hide the ugliest secrets of a family. I presented the receipt and Richard's key to the clerk. He looked at the tarnished brass key with mild curiosity and pointed me toward the rear of the facility. The air inside was humid and thick. My heart was racing, a desperate pulse against the heavy silence. The storage unit was small, maybe 5 feet by 5. I slid the key into the tumbler. The lock clicked open with a sound that was deafening in the silence. I pulled the heavy, metallic door up. The unit wasn't empty. It contained a single item, sitting squarely in the center of the concrete floor, illuminated by the harsh overhead light. A well-worn, leather briefcase. It was an old, classic briefcase, the kind lawyers and accountants carried in the 1980s. It was scratched, the leather dry, the combination locks tarnished. It wasn't a safe deposit box. It was a lawyer's briefcase. Richard's briefcase. The one he had used back in 1985 when he was a junior financial consultant for PCLD. The heading suddenly made agonizing sense. What I found in his briefcase destroyed me. My trembling hands fumbled with the combination. Richard hadn't told me the code. I tried my birthday. Nothing. I tried my father's birthday. Nothing. I felt panic rising in my throat. I tried Richard's daughter's birthday, Sarah's. Click. The lid sprang open. The smell of old paper, stagnant air, and regret flooded out. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not a ledger or a confession. It was a single, thick manila folder. The label on the tab was handwritten in my father's familiar, elegant script, Thorne Adoption File / PCLD Contingency. I pulled the folder out. The word adoption swam on the page, sucking all the air out of the room. I wasn't an innocent beneficiary of a crime. I was an adopted child, and my entire life was a contingency plan for a crime. I sank onto the concrete floor, feeling the cold seep into my bones. The pages were a blur, but 2 stood out. A 1985 private investigator's report. It detailed an affair between my mother, Miriam, and Richard. The affair was contemporaneous with the PCLD embezzlement scheme. The report indicated Miriam and Richard were planning to leave their respective partners. A handwritten memo from my father, dated 1985. It was addressed to his lawyer. He confessed to facilitating the PCLD embezzlement to provide for Miriam and his soon-to-be adopted son, me. But the memo went further. It claimed that after discovering Miriam and Richard's affair, his motive changed. He structured the PCLD stock to go into the adoption savings account only on the condition that Richard was kept in his life, and that the existence of the PCLD stock was tied to the adoption and not to the embezzlement. The truth was a sudden reveal, a tone shift from calm certainty to utter panic. I wasn't just betrayed by my mother. I was the product of that betrayal. My entire identity, my name, my memories of a loving father who died of a broken heart. All of it was a lie designed to protect Richard and Miriam's relationship and the PCLD money. I didn't know it then, but the adoption file was the ultimate blackmail tool. My father had given me a choice. Either expose the affair and the embezzlement, thereby destroying my entire family structure, or keep the money and pretend I was his son. Richard and Miriam had used the fear of exposure to keep me quiet for 40 years. I stood up, shaking my head. I looked at the briefcase, at the evidence. The full truth. My father committed suicide to ensure his final, cruel revenge was executed. By making Richard the secondary beneficiary on his life insurance, and making Richard the one who paid for the safe deposit box, he guaranteed that Richard would forever be tied to my mother, the money, and the darkest secret of all. The fact that I was Richard's son. I had to confront them both. Not at midnight, but in the light of day. I couldn't do it alone. I picked up the burner phone, the one Richard and Miriam had used, and dialed the only contact saved, the architect. Miriam picked up on the second ring. "David? Are you in Miami?" she whispered. "I found the briefcase, Mom," I said, my voice empty. "I found the adoption file. I know that Richard is my father. And I know the fire was a lie." There was silence on the other end. Realistic pauses. I waited, listened. Nothing. Then, a sudden realization hit me, a sensory shift. My father's memo mentioned the PCLD stock was tied to the adoption. If the adoption was legally voided, say if it was proven my birth mother, Miriam, and birth father, Richard, colluded to hide my parentage, the PCLD assets would automatically revert to the original estate, which was currently tied up in probate. She admitted it, but there's more, I thought. The documents confirmed my parentage, but they offered a way out. A way to legally destroy Richard using his own crime. "David," my mother finally said, her voice strained, "I need to tell you where the original PCLD ledger is. The one that proves Richard embezzled the initial funds. You need to see the evidence." "I'll meet you," I said, "but not alone. Bring Richard. We're meeting at Thomas Vance's office. At midnight." I stood in that empty Miami storage unit, the single light bulb humming, holding the briefcase that contained the shattered remnants of my life. I am Richard's son. The emotional devastation was total. It was worse than being fired, worse than the financial fraud, worse than the suicide. My entire foundation, my identity as David Thorne, the son of the respected, kind-hearted George Thorne, was a 4-decade-long lie. I looked at the burner phone in my hand, the one used by my mother and Richard to coordinate my firing. I had just hung up with Miriam. I told her I knew. I told her to bring Richard and the original PCLD ledger to Thomas Vance's office at midnight. I should have felt fury, but all I felt was cold, surgical calm. My father's plan, his ultimate cruel revenge, was finally clear. He hadn't just arranged the money. He had arranged me. By tying the PCLD fortune to the adoption, he knew that one day, when the secret inevitably broke, I would be forced to face the truth. The man who fired me was my biological father, and the woman I called Mom engineered my emotional life as a cover story. The money was merely the mechanism of his final, perfect betrayal. I reached back into the briefcase. The adoption file was tucked next to a small, sealed cassette tape. It was unlabeled, except for a tiny, faded sticker that read, Last Wishes GT. Etin George Thorne. My father. I didn't know it then, but this cassette wasn't a confession of the crime. It was a confession of the betrayal. I ran out of the storage facility. I found an old electronics store nearby and bought a cheap portable cassette player. I drove into a secluded parking lot, my hands trembling as I slid the tiny tape into the machine. The plastic clunked. I hit play. The hiss of static was deafening for a moment. Then, my father's voice, deep, weary, and tragically familiar, filled the silence of the car. It was a timestamp. It sounded like a voicemail. Miriam, if you're hearing this, it's over. I've done what I had to do. The adoption papers are filed. The PCLD stock is secured in the boy's name. He'll always be protected. But you need to understand something, Miriam. This isn't protection. This is my legacy. His voice broke, confessional, emotionally raw. You cheated on me with Richard, Miriam. You planned to leave me. You used my name, my trust, and my career to hide the PCLD embezzlement you orchestrated. The fire, that was my desperation. I tried to burn the evidence of your connection, to save you from jail, even though you betrayed me. But when I realized you and Richard were still seeing each other after the initial audit passed, when you told me you were going to raise David together, I knew I had to act. I had to choose a side. My father paused. The sound of his shaky breath was agonizing. I didn't leave a confession for the police, Miriam. I left a confession for Richard. He'll find the safe deposit key, and he'll find this file. He will know that my son, the boy I chose to adopt, the boy he biologically fathered, will eventually inherit the money Richard thought was his. I've made David legally and financially dependent on the lie. Richard will have to keep working for you, Miriam, to protect the secret of David's parentage. And David, my adopted son, will one day be forced to destroy the man who raised him and the woman who loved him. The message was brutal. It was a time capsule of pure, distilled revenge. My father hadn't died of a broken heart. He had weaponized it. He committed suicide to trigger a legal and emotional trap that would snare Richard and my mother for 40 years, forcing them to live a lie and eventually forcing me, his adopted son, to be the executioner. I ripped the tape out of the player. The confession had destroyed the last piece of my old life, the belief that my father was a good man. He was a master strategist, a victim of betrayal who became a morally complex architect of ruin. I didn't know it then, but Richard's last voicemail to my father would complete the picture. I drove back north, toward Thomas Vance's office in my hometown. It was late. The city lights blurred through the windshield. I had the adoption file, the lighter, the storage receipt, the burner phone, and my father's audio confession. I was armed with the truth. I reached Vance's office at 11:58 p.m. I saw two cars parked in the shadows. Richard's expensive sedan and my mother's small, sensible compact. I walked into the reception area. The office was dimly lit. Thomas Vance was sitting there, his face grim. My mother and Richard were already in the conference room. Richard is hysterical, David, Vance whispered. He brought a stack of files. He looks like he hasn't slept in a week. Your mother is just numb. I walked into the conference room. They were sitting at the massive, dark table. Richard looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. Miriam didn't move. "I'm late," I said, dropping the briefcase onto the table. The loud thud was all the introduction I needed. "But I bring the truth." I opened the briefcase and slid the manila folder across the table to Richard. He opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the adoption file. The private investigator's report. The memo. The color drained from his face as he realized I knew. His secret, "I am Richard's son," was out. "It's true, David," he choked out, tears finally welling up. "I'm your biological father. George arranged it all. He gave me the money, but he took my life." "Where is the PCLD ledger, Miriam?" I asked, looking at my mother. She finally lifted her head. She looked at Richard, a look of profound hatred and regret passing between them. "It's not here," she said, her voice dry. "The original ledger. It's hidden inside your father's tombstone. He put it there. The night he died." I laughed. It wasn't a nice sound. It was the sound of something inside me breaking. A shattering of the final illusion of my father's sanity. The full betrayal. "The tombstone," I whispered. "But I can tell you something else, David," Richard interrupted, his voice desperate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Before George died, he called me. I didn't answer. I kept the voicemail. This is his final, complete confession. Not just the crime, David. The entire truth." He reached to press play. But before he could, the door burst open. Standing there was a figure I didn't recognize. A woman in a dark uniform. "David Thorne, Richard Sterling, Miriam Thorne," she announced, her voice authoritative. "You are under arrest. We found the wire." The entrance of the woman in the dark uniform, a woman who declared us all under arrest, was the perfect pattern interrupt. The air in Thomas Vance's office, thick with betrayal and decades of lies, instantly solidified into cold, hard legal reality. Richard froze, his thumb hovering over the play button on his phone, the one that held my father's final voicemail. My mother, Miriam, finally registered the gravity of the situation, her numb facade cracking into pure, terrified panic. "You are under arrest," the woman repeated, pulling out a badge. "SEC Fraud Unit. We found the wire." "The wire," I repeated, looking around the room. The woman, a stern agent named Miller, pointed to the briefcase I had just dropped onto the conference table. "The thermal paper receipt. The one you found inside the gold lighter. It wasn't just a receipt, Mr. Thorne. It was micro-etched with a high-density audio surveillance wire, tracking the location of the safe deposit key Richard kept. And your lawyer, Thomas Vance, was the one who informed us." I turned to Vance. He looked grave but professional. "I had to, David. When you told me about the PCLD fortune being tied to an original 1985 embezzlement, I had a legal and ethical obligation. That money is dirty. I used the lighter Richard's key as bait. We needed to confirm the conspiracy. The sheer, surgical ruthlessness of it stunned me. I wasn't just chasing the truth. I was being used as a live wire in a high-stakes, decades-old financial takedown. We have surveillance photos of Ms. Thorne meeting Mr. Sterling outside the bank and entering his residence. Agent Miller continued, moving toward Richard. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud and obstruction of justice." Richard didn't resist. He was defeated. He reached out to me, his biological son, one last time. David, the voicemail. It explains everything. Please, play it. No. Miriam screamed. Richard, don't. It will expose the boy. Agent Miller grabbed Richard's arm. In a final, desperate act, Richard flung his phone across the table. It slid to a stop right in front of me. The screen was still on the voicemail menu. We need the original PCLD ledger, Agent Miller demanded, turning to Miriam. You confessed it was hidden in the tombstone. Where is it now? Miriam simply shook her head, tears finally falling. She was the architect, but she was broken. She didn't respond. Agent Miller handcuffed her, and they were led out of the office. It was 1:15 a.m. Just me, Thomas Vance, and the evidence. The briefcase, the adoption file, and Richard's phone containing my father's final, lethal confession. Richard is your biological father, David. Your mother and father, George, conspired with him to create this situation. Vance summarized, adjusting his tie. The SEC will seize the PCLD fortune as proceeds of crime. You, as the technically innocent beneficiary, will be left with nothing. I was financially back where I started, broke and fired. But I had the truth. There has to be a way, I insisted, picking up the adoption file. George was a lawyer, Vance. He was framing Richard, but he was also protecting me. He was a master of legal loopholes. The money was tied to the adoption, not the crime. Vance sighed. It's complicated, David. Very complicated. But I pressed him. I forced him to look at the documents again. I kept coming back to one line in my father's handwritten memo. The PCLD stock must be seen as the adopted son's inheritance, purchased with legitimate pre-1985 funds. Look at the date on the first stock purchase, I urged, pointing to the bank statement in the file. It was purchased 3 days before the embezzlement was reported to the PCLD board. It was legally separate. Vance's eyes widened. He grabbed the bank statement, his legal mind racing. The stock was purchased with George's personal funds, not the embezzled funds. George structured the first purchase, the one that started the automatic plan, using legitimate money. It was the only way to shield the account. I didn't know it then, but this seemingly innocuous detail was the single, impossible legal loophole my father had planned for 40 years. He used the first purchase to sanitize the entire fund, Vance whispered, tracing the numbers with his finger. He created an illusion of legitimacy. If we can prove the first purchase was valid, the entire $2.7 million stock plan is legally his, your inheritance, not the proceeds of crime. The realization hit us both simultaneously. My father hadn't just used the money as a weapon. He had created a legal fortress around it. He used his last moments not just to seek revenge, but to provide for me, his adopted son, in the most complex, morally ambiguous way possible. The SEC is seizing the money as we speak, Vance said urgently. We have to file an immediate injunction to prove the legitimacy of that first purchase. We need more than that, I said, my voice steady. I picked up Richard's phone. The key to the entire plan and to my identity was the voicemail. We need his final confession, not for the police, for the court. I pressed the play button on Richard's phone. My father's final, haunting message filled the silence of the conference room. It detailed the affair, the framing of Richard, the adoption, and the entire motive behind the PCLD money. But the recording didn't end there. After my father's confession, there was an audible click. Then Richard's voice. He had recorded his own response on the voicemail system, thinking it was a live call. Richard's voice, desperate and raw. "George, you don't understand. Miriam is pregnant. With my child. I wanted to raise David as my own, too. I didn't want the money. I just wanted a family. You ruined us all." I stared at the phone. Miriam is pregnant. It wasn't just me. Richard and Miriam had another child, a sibling I never knew about. The family had expanded, quietly, destructively, decades ago. Vance looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. "The SEC will be back for you, David. This recording, it changes everything. We need to find your sibling." The silence in Thomas Vance's office, after my father's final voicemail played and Richard's own desperate confession. "Miriam is pregnant. With my child," was total. The SEC agent, Miller, had just left with my mother and Richard. But the weight of that recording remained. A heavy, cold truth. I wasn't just an adopted son. I was the eldest son in a fractured family, and I had a younger sibling, Richard and Miriam's biological child, who had been living a lie just like me, or perhaps living completely in the dark. "David," Thomas Vance said, his voice grave, breaking the silence. "The SEC has seized the PCLD assets, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation." But the voicemail, Richard's confession that he didn't want the money, only a family, that changes the entire motive. And the existence of another sibling. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "If we prove the original stock purchase was legitimate, and that your father intended the money for his adopted heir, you get the $2.7 million. But if Richard has another biological child with Miriam, that child is also an heir to his estate, and potentially a claimant to the PCLD fortune." I didn't know it then, but the next 72 hours would be a race against time. A choice between emotional closure and cold, surgical revenge. I walked out of the office and drove straight to the one place I knew would contain the answer. My mother's house. She was in custody, but I knew she had one secret place she never allowed anyone to touch. The old photo albums on the top shelf of her hallway closet. I broke the lock. The smell of dust and mothballs filled the air. I pulled down the largest album, labeled 1987 to 1995. The images were a blur. Birthday parties, holidays, me growing up. But then, on the page for Christmas 1991, the pattern changed. There was a photo, slightly blurred, of Richard holding a small child. A girl with bright blonde hair and Miriam's sharp eyes. The caption, handwritten by Miriam, was simple: "Sarah's first snow." Sarah, Richard's daughter. The one whose birthday was his security code. The one he named his password after. The one he claimed was just his daughter from his previous marriage. I didn't know it then, but Richard's daughter was my sister, and she was the key to my revenge. I should have known when he always dismissed any questions about Sarah's childhood that he was hiding a mountain of guilt. But I was so focused on my own betrayal, I never looked closely at his life. I drove to Richard's mansion. It was sealed with crime scene tape. I ignored it. I walked in using the staff code one last time. I found Sarah's room. It was immaculate, untouched since her last visit. I searched the room, looking for anything that tied Sarah to PCLD. I found it in a leather-bound high school yearbook. In the notes section, Richard had written a loving inscription. "Always remember your grandfather's hard work. PCLD forever. Love, Dad." The final piece of the puzzle. Richard and Miriam had raised me, their biological son, as a legal stranger to his own fortune, while raising Sarah, their biological daughter, in the full comfort of their wealth. The betrayal wasn't singular. It was systemic. My old life was gone. My family was a crime scene. I had two choices: seek emotional closure, play my father's voicemail and Richard's confession for the court, proving the original PCLD embezzlement was real. This would legally void the innocent purchase loophole, ensuring the money was seized by the SEC. Miriam and Richard would face the maximum sentence. I would be legally clean, but emotionally shattered and financially ruined. Choose surgical revenge. File the injunction on the PCLD fortune immediately, using George's loophole to prove the legitimacy of the first purchase. This would secure the $2.7 million for myself. I would then use the money to destroy Richard's final asset, his restaurant empire, the prime rib, and expose Sarah as the true heir to a fraud.
I chose revenge.
It was a clean, sharp, devastating knife cut. I called Thomas Vance. "Vance," I said, my voice cold, professional. "File the injunction immediately. Use the legitimate first purchase loophole. We are securing the PCLD fortune in my name." "David, that means you're protecting your mother and Richard from the full weight of the SEC," Vance argued. "If the money is proven legitimate, the conspiracy charges become much weaker." "I don't want them in jail," I replied. "I want them broke, and I want them to watch their legacy burn. They destroyed my life. I will destroy theirs." The next week was a blur of legal maneuvers. I leveraged the $2.7 million PCLD fortune, secured by the injunction, to become a majority shareholder in Richard's restaurant holding company. He was in jail facing charges, and his voting rights were suspended. I called an emergency board meeting. I didn't show up. I sent Thomas Vance in my place. Vance delivered the news. "Mr. Thorne has assumed control of this company. He is liquidating all assets. Effective immediately, the prime rib and all subsidiary restaurants are permanently closed. The restaurant empire, the 20 years of my life I had dedicated to Richard, was dismantled in 48 hours. The yachts, the corporate jets, the private shares, all sold to cover the massive liabilities I fabricated. I sent the first check from the sale to Sarah, a cashier's check for $500,000, labeled simply, "From your half-brother, David, for your college fund." I was financially independent, legally protected, and armed with the full, devastating truth. I hadn't destroyed my mother and father physically, but I had decimated their pride, their wealth, and their comfort. But I still had the voicemail, the one that contained my father's final confession and Richard's desperate cry about his secret child. I drove to the cemetery. It was raining. I found George Thorne's headstone simple, dignified, a master strategist. I knelt down in the mud. I placed Richard's phone on the wet earth and pressed play on the voicemail, the sound of my father's final, tired confession, detailing his betrayal, his revenge, and his plan to trap Richard and Miriam, echoed in the silent cemetery. I should have felt closure, but the moment I heard my father's voice, a single, devastating realization struck me. The voicemail wasn't just a confession. It was the only unedited proof that George Thorne had committed suicide. If I revealed it, the legal loophole that had protected the PCLD money and secured my freedom would be instantly voided. The SEC would seize the money, and I would be back where I started. And then, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Someone was standing in the rain, watching me. "Hello, David," a voice said. I looked up. Standing there, holding a black umbrella, was Richard. I looked up. Standing over me in the pouring rain holding a cheap black umbrella that seemed too small for his imposing figure, was Richard. He looked gaunt, aged 10 years in 10 days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and the fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, weary exhaustion. He was out on bail. "I see you found George's final piece of insurance," Richard said, his voice a low, rough rumble that barely carried over the steady drumming of the rain. He nodded at the phone lying on the wet earth, the screen still displaying the voicemail I had just played. The one that detailed the suicide, the PCLD trap, and Richard's desperate, recorded confession about Miriam being pregnant with his child Sarah. "They released you," I stated, my voice flat. "Who paid the bond? You liquidated everything." "Eleanor Vance did," Richard confessed, the admission heavy with implication. "She's working on securing Miriam's lighter sentence. She used the last remaining trust fund, the one George set up for Sarah, not you. He left a contingency for her, too. George Thorne was a monster, David, but he was a meticulous monster." I stood up, wiping the mud from my hands. "You knew I was Richard's son, and you still fired me. You still watched me struggle while you protected the lie. You destroyed my life to save yourself, Richard." "I destroyed the life George gave you," he corrected, stepping closer. "Because that life was a chain, David. He chained us all. That voicemail you just played? It's not just a confession of his suicide. It's the final knot in the noose he built for us." I pushed back. "The noose is gone. I secured the PCLD fortune using his legal loophole. I liquidated your company. Your empire is gone, Richard. I chose revenge and I won." Richard looked at me, not with anger, but with tragic pity. "You think destroying the prime rib was revenge? You destroyed Sarah's future, David. She was managing the flagship restaurant in Chicago. She was pregnant. That $500,000 you sent her is a bandage on a gunshot wound." The words hit me with devastating force. My surgical revenge wasn't clean. It had collateral damage. I had destroyed my half-sister's financial security. The realization that I was hurting the innocent child of my two betrayers was the only thing that felt worse than the initial betrayal itself. "Why are you here, Richard?" I demanded. "To beg for mercy?" "I'm here to tell you the final truth," he said, holding up a small, sealed plastic bag containing a damp, folded piece of paper. "George didn't just hide the PCLD ledger in the tombstone. He hid this." He unfolded the paper. It was a note, handwritten by my father, George Thorne, and addressed to Richard. "Richard, the voicemail is my confession. The adoption file is your leverage. The PCLD money is David's due. But this last instruction is a test. The tombstone holds the fabricated ledger that would prove Miriam and I framed you in '85. If you use it, you're free, but Miriam goes to jail, and David's inheritance is tied up in litigation for a decade. If you destroy it, you must live with the consequences of your betrayal, but David is free. Your final choice. Ruin Miriam or choose the boy you couldn't raise." The true architect of the entire saga was my adoptive father, George. He didn't want justice. He wanted an unending war of conscience. He wanted Richard to choose between his lover, Miriam, and his son, me. "I chose you, David," Richard whispered. "I destroyed the tombstone ledger the minute I got out of jail. I told Eleanor to use the last of my money to get Miriam out, too. The SEC charges are weakened because the original ledger is gone, and the fabricated one that frames me is destroyed. We all walk away damaged, but breathing. The only thing left is the truth in that phone. He pointed to the recording. That voicemail. It's the only proof of George's suicide. If the SEC learns George committed suicide, the insurance claim is void, the PCLD fund is reclassified as a fraudulent endowment, and the entire $2.7 million is seized. You lose it all. Sarah loses her $500,000. Everything. The storm of choices ceased. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival. If I destroyed the voicemail, I kept the money, secured Sarah's future, and allowed Richard and Miriam to face lesser charges. A long, miserable life, not a quick death in prison. If I released it, I gained moral purity but ruined everyone, including myself. I looked at Richard, my biological father, the man who had fired me, now begging me to save the one thing left. His integrity and my future. I didn't want the money. David? Richard said, tears mixing with the rain on his face. I just wanted to be a father. I failed you once when I let George take you. Don't let me fail you now. I picked up the wet phone. I looked at the screen at the option to forward the audio. I stared at the tombstone, at the name of George Thorne, the man who loved me enough to provide a fortune, but hated his wife enough to weaponize my life. I didn't know it then, but choosing this moment was the only way to finally break the chain. I didn't release the audio. I opened the file manager, scrolled to the voicemail, and slowly, deliberately, pressed delete. The sound was a single, silent click in the pouring rain. The truth was gone. The moral clarity was gone. But the $2.7 million and Sarah's future were safe. Richard stood there watching. He didn't speak. He just slowly nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible choice I had made. He had peace. I had a fortune and a conscience in tatters. 3 years later, I'm sitting in my office in downtown Seattle. It's a small, modest space, but the view of the bay is spectacular. I didn't waste the money. I used the PCLD fortune to create the George Thorne Legacy Foundation, a bitter irony that would forever tie my adopted father's name to the truth of his lie. The foundation's mission: to acquire failing service businesses and turn them into job training and mentorship centers for underprivileged youth. And the prime rib? I bought the liquidated name and leased the properties. They are now run as the Thorne Training Institute, a network of restaurants that train the next generation. I turned Richard's empire into a philanthropic machine, but it's still mine. I haven't seen Miriam or Richard in person since that night in the cemetery. Miriam is serving a minimal sentence, house arrest in a small, remote property. She spends her days knitting, and I deposit an anonymous stipend into her account every month. She will live a long, miserable life, constantly aware of the fortune she lost and the son she betrayed. Richard got off with a substantial fine and 5 years of strict probation. He's working as an independent business consultant now. He's happy because he is a grandfather. My phone rings. It's a text message with a photo attached. Sarah. She named her son George. I never told Sarah the full truth. I told her the money was a settlement from a decades-old corporate lawsuit. She has no idea Richard is my father or that I destroyed his life to save hers. She is happy, a new mother, running a small bakery business I helped her set up. I text Richard a simple message. He's beautiful. My choice was final. I live with the knowledge of the lie, but I used the consequence of my father's revenge to build something real. The money is here. The truth is buried. I am the architect of my own life now, the inheritor of a lie, and the protector of an innocent child. I didn't get emotional closure, but I got justice, my own unique and unforgettable kind of justice. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the bay. The rain has stopped. The sun is shining. The unforgettable way I saw my boss again 3 years later wasn't a confrontation. It was a choice to keep the secret, to protect the innocent, and to finally build a legacy that was better than the one I inherited. Story completion.